Hello, and you are welcome to this week's episode of Indo Politics. I'm Tabitha Monahan. It was a week filled with policy launches, sectoral plans, and press conferences. So, to go through all of this, I'm joined by my colleague, political correspondent with the Irish and Sunday Independent, Cónal Thomas. I think we'll start with immigration. That really was the big one this week. We knew a lot of the detail that was coming out that Jim O'Callaghan announced this week. So one of the things I think we'll start with is the contribution model, because something that surprised me, but I think was coming all along, was the question that you asked Jim O'Callaghan at that press conference around the standard of the accommodation. So just to bring listeners and viewers up to speed on some of the rules that are coming in relation to this contribution model. Depending on how much income you are earning, and if you're in an international protection accommodation, you'll be expected to pay anywhere between €15 and €238 per week. And obviously, like I said, it's a sliding scale. The more money you earn, the more in a contribution fee you will have to pay. But as you said, there's a number of people who, when they arrive here seeking international protection, that they're essentially handed a tent. And if they're earning an income, they will be expected to pay.
Yeah, I mean, as the system's become more and more overwhelmed over the last few years, you recall the, barricades at Main Street and the tents
Up along the canal.
up along the canal there, and Simon Harris, when his Taoiseach, kind of one of his first steps was to go in and clear that because it was becoming a health hazard. But as you say, so this contribution model is being introduced now. And Jim O'Callaghan, the Justice Minister, I suppose, has justified it by saying that if people come here and they're applying for international protection and they're working, which you're allowed to do, it is only fair that they pay a contribution. But on the other hand, there are a number of people, there's about 400 people, IP applicants living in tents at the moment. Now, we don't have figures exactly on how many of them would be in work, but as I put it to Jim O'Callaghan, will they have to pay? And he effectively confirmed that they would. It was interesting. It was a 40-minute press conference yesterday where they ran through all of these measures, which, as I say, had been well flagged. And I think towards the end of it, Jim O'Callaghan was getting kind of more and more defensive about these changes. But in a way, you can see the justification for them in many respects, because it's kind of about two things. One is the current system is at capacity, and we know that. So it's been stretched and stretched and stretched and stretched. And, there's this constant pressure, and it's exacerbating the housing crisis. And they've been brought in these new rules around family reunification as well, which you might talk about a little bit because you've done a bit of work on it. And then, of course, there is the issue, I suppose, of population growth, because as Jim O'Callaghan said yesterday, the population has grown by about 1.6% last year. That's 7 times the EU average. And so it feels in many ways about what these changes are bringing in is getting ahead of a problem that's already built up on the government's doorstep, right?
And I think that's an important point. It's been on the government's doorstep, and you mentioned capacity in the system again, which is something that the government has overseen in relation to capacity issues. When did we have that white paper from Roderick O'Gorman that said they were going to end direct provision? And we're kind of in a very different space in terms of immigration and the narrative and the conversation that we're having. Again, housing crisis always comes up. Again, the government are the ones that haven't been able to meet their targets in relation to housing. So while Jim O'Callaghan is trying to combat the increase in population growth, which he has flagged a number of times, and even some of the numbers in relation to that, asylum seekers, 18,500 last year. Temporary protection, around 10,000 people sought that last year. Student permits, there was about 60,000 last year. Work visas, about 12,500 people last year. But then the UK and EU, I think there was about 32,000 people who came here that last year. So a lot of these measures are targeting the people who are coming over with work permits. A lot of those we need either for the healthcare sector or the, care homes, etc. Asylum seekers are entitled to come over here and seek asylum.
There is a concern, though, within the work permits as well. Are we going to send people into the black market here?
Yeah.
And that is going to be something that might play out over the coming months and years. The other figure, I suppose, is the family reunification changes that have been brought in, where effectively they would limit the number of people you can bring over. That there was 23,000 people were granted family reunification last year between the two separate categories. Look, the government has framed this as a fairer and firmer immigration system. We've seen the UK and the changes they have brought in. This isn't entirely in response to that. This was in the
This was
works.
done before, yeah.
This was in the works for some time, but what we're seeing now is an acceleration a little bit of some of these measures, and probably more to come in response to the UK's changes, which they've brought in. And bear in mind, was something that Jim O'Callaghan, there's often been this figure bandied around, and it's been called into question in the past that around 80% of asylum seekers come in through Northern Ireland. Jim O'Callaghan suggested yesterday that it's now at about 87%.
Yeah.
So, like, I think, there was quite a long spiel by Jim O'Callaghan before he introduced all these measures around the family reunification changes and the contribution model, etc., etc. And he was saying, he was framing it, I suppose, in this way that, we do need asylum seekers. We do need skilled workers. We do need people coming here and contributing to society. Population growth is a good thing. We can't go back to the past where our population was declining. However, it is now at such an extraordinary rate that we need to put tighter rules on how long people can stay here. And another thing that I suppose he mentioned yesterday was this. He kept coming out with this line around citizenship. So we know now that there's new rules around how long you can apply for, how long you could be living here, resident for citizenship, and whether you've been in receipt of social welfare payments. And he kept coming back to this line that citizenship is a right that the state gives somebody.
Yeah.
It's
not an entitlement. You're not entitled to do it when you're here. So the rules around citizenship is to bring everybody in line with one rule. So there was kind of rules depending on what kind of migrant you were, where you were coming from. So for example, if you were an asylum seeker or if an international protection applicant and you were granted international protection here, you only needed to be resident here for 3 years before you could apply for citizenship. Everybody else, it was 5 years. So as part of that rule, they want to bring everybody in line with that 5-year rule. So that's one of the things. The other aspect of this was in relation to asylum seekers who have been granted asylum, but if they're deemed to be a danger to society, that their asylum status can be revoked.
And the citizenship thing as well, the other thing the government are considering, and if you take all of these measures together, it's hard not to see this as anything other than a suite of deterrence. That's what this is.
It's a focus on the pull factors rather than the push factors where that a lot of people come.
Exactly. And I mean, even there was one small thing that the citizenship is one thing, but then they're also going to review how much it costs to get citizenship. So it looks like they're probably going to increase the application fee from €850 and upwards. So all of these incremental changes, all of these, as you say, these pull factors are kind of gradually being chipped away at because of, as he's saying, the population is simply growing too quickly and we do not have enough room to accommodate everyone. And it was funny, I think at one point Jim O'Callaghan said he'd rather be there talking about anything other than, in his brief, other than this, but this has to be spoken about. And at one point he says, wouldn't it be very virtuous if we could welcome everyone into the country and give everyone homes? But we simply can't. Politically, I think it's very interesting because if you recall, it was only maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago we were sitting here and Simon Harris was being criticised left, right and centre for his comments on immigration and being compared to Nigel Farage in the UK.
Saying it was too high.
But he got ahead of it, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Family reunification, they are going to be introducing a fee for that, which is one of the new rules in relation to that. There's also just going to be tighter measures in relation to what kind of family member you can essentially sponsor to come over here. So it'll be those immediate family members will still be allowed to come over, the spouses, the partners, children who are minors. There'll be tighter rules around people who are going to be dependents that'll come over here. That'll be more difficult. Another aspect of this is you have to have a certain amount of income to be able to prove that you can
support
this person that you want to bring over, but also that you will have to prove that you have suitable accommodation as well. This is an interesting one, or maybe potentially a controversial one, because again, it's in relation to those pull and push factors and whether or not that's going to be a deterrent. we want people to come over here and work in certain industries where we know we are lacking in the labour force here. We just don't have the people to work in care homes, to work in the HSE. Like, how many times have we heard that the HSE would be on the verge of collapse if people who had come over with work permits decided to leave? And, you know, we'd be in a serious situation. I mean, the health service is already in a serious situation with these people. It would be even worse without them. If it's seen to be more difficult to bring a family member, and like, this is including a child, like a minor under 18 years of age, you'll have to have a minimum amount, is it 40,000, 44,000 gross income to bring one minor over. That is your child over. So it's not, and that's a lot of money. That's not.
But it goes up. I mean, there's people who
And it goes up.
have 8 who might want to bring 8, and they might be earning about $250,000.
Yeah.
So it's clearly saying to people, if you want to stay, if you want family reunification, again, 23,000 people were granted. You have to be able to support people. One thing that was reported today, the Irish Times, I thought was interesting, was that people who are granted status who were living in direct provision will not be charged this contribution fees. And I think the concern there would be you wouldn't want to create effectively a landlord-tenant situation between the state and migrants who come here and international protection applicants.
Yeah. The thing with the family reunification thing, though, just going back to it briefly, we've seen protests outside Leinster House. You know, a lot of people who are on work permits who want to bring family members over are saying it's already incredibly difficult to do that in the first place. Is that going to be a deterrent for people, especially people that we really need in the system?
I think the Social Democrats have put it, you know, succinctly, that in the reaction to a lot of these rules, particularly around work permits. In other words, they effectively said all of these will make life more difficult for migrants. But I can't help but feel that that is the point.
Yeah. Interesting that something that you said earlier on was Jim O'Callaghan during the press conference, and I've heard him in interviews since. He was on RT as well, talking about these new rules. There is an element of defensiveness to his approach and his explanation of all of these measures. Is that inevitable because of the type of measures these are and the conversation that's going on around immigration?
I think he even said himself, it's never a comfortable conversation.
Yeah, it isn't.
It never has been. And then, while on the one hand, the government trying to, as I say, get ahead of a problem that's been at their doorstep for some time. And this really marks such a shift from when the Green Party were over this brief. You remember that this was brought back into justice at the start of the current coalition. But politically across Europe, every government is coming under pressure from people who say that if you don't get migration and immigration under control, we're going to vote for someone else.
Yeah.
It may not be as stark or as pronounced in Ireland, but it is there. And this government's acutely aware of it. And it's no different in a sense to what now James Brown in housing would have been doing over the last 9 months, where he's constantly said, I'm not waiting for a plan, I'm going to go out and do this. That's what these measures are. Bear in mind, there's a new international protection bill coming down the line. You'll see a lot of that in there.
Yeah, we have the EU Asylum Pact coming in next summer.
And then in terms of Jim O'Callaghan, I mean, I don't know whether he had to be in the Shannon at 12.
That's just for listeners to know. We were meant to be in the press centre in government buildings at 12 o'clock, and we were told he has to be in the Shannon at 1:45, so that's how long you have to ask questions.
Yeah. And what was interesting towards the end of the press conference, he was kind of challenged on the kind of the UK stuff, saying, can you not make some sort of protocol agreement between two companies? If you want to go off and negotiate that with the Home Secretary, be my guest, but that's not going to happen.
Yeah, he also made the point that while we know that a lot of people from the UK are using the border and the common travel area to come into Ireland that way, Jim O'Callaghan made the point that there are people in Dublin that are actually using the common travel area to get into the UK as well. Yeah. So it's not just a one-way street, essentially, is his argument.
And he's always said as well that the UK stuff that came in recently is something that they may need to take further action on. He will have to do that immediately, or he will do that as a priority to government. So look, a lot of these measures, they might make a lot of sense. I just think politically it's going to be difficult if and when you see more people homeless, right, as a result of this, or things becoming harder for people. If it acts in the deterrent that they think or hope it will be, well then, let's see. I mean, I think a lot of this is probably stuff people would argue should have been done quite some time ago. But I suppose it depends on how far they want to go on this. kind of thing.
Yeah, and also what their potential response could be to whatever the UK introduces, and if that's
Yeah.
going to have some kind of knock-on effect here. You mentioned the Green Party earlier on and how different the approach is to this government to how the last government is approaching things with the Greens. And the same could be said for transport, because we saw the sectoral plan for transport was published this week as well. So that's just as part of the National Development Plan, the Department of Transport is setting out where exactly the money that it's been allocated, what projects it's going to go on. And one of the things that you spotted in that is that there's almost a 1-for-1 in terms of how much money is being spent on public transport and how much is being spent on roads. Like, there is a small variation. I think it's 10.1 on public transport and then 9.7 on roads.
For some reason,
€1 billion, by the way.
for some reason, Darragh O'Brien, the Transport Minister, could seem to deny that or dismiss this.
Yeah, that point was put to him because in the previous government,
Yeah.
it was a 2-to-1 ratio
Yes.
of public transport to roads. And that point was put to him. It was like, okay, well, this is obviously the Green Party's legacy is gone now. Obviously, they're not in government anymore because it's now 1-for-1. And Darragh O'Brien said, well, no, it's not. And well, no, it really, really is.
And if we go back at like the 2-to-1 ratio on roads versus public transport, was public transport versus roads something that under Eamon Ryan, and then towards the tail end of the government, it was privately criticised by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and they all came out on the campaign trail and said, no, we need roads. And yet, so the NDP sectoral plan was published yesterday, and what do we see? We see about €22 billion allocated to transport projects out to the end of the decade. Of that, there's about 10.1 allocated to public transport. There's 9.7 to roads. How anyone can say that's not a 1-to-1 ratio is beyond me. Now, they will argue there's a separate €2 billion that is from the Climate and Nature Fund, I believe, that the Green Party has said has been raided. That's going to be used for Metrolink to get Metrolink up to the construction phase. And now we might move on to Metrolink in a minute, but so that's the sectoral plan. It is now 1-to-1. That Green Party thing they've shut the door on that. I'm not quite entirely sure why they would take issue with that. And this was something that Sean Canny and a lot of rural TDs and Michael Healy-Rae would have been pushing for. That he would have said, we told the people. What was it? What was the word he used? Tar.
More tar.
More tar. And we gave them tar, and that's what he'd said. And they delivered that. Okay, fair enough. But the other thing is, so many of these road projects have been delayed for years. Yeah. So it's really just hard to, and the same with some of these public transports in the NDP that was outlined yesterday. When are they actually going to be delivered? Now, Darragh O'Brien said we are going to, we're going to hold our feet to the fire here. We'll be responsible for this. But you had a lot of Green people out today saying, well, hang on a minute, you've actually delayed the public transport projects that were under our remit. So, there's always this debate around whether, public transport versus roads. There was a huge amount invested. But I will just say this. I mean, if you look at the active travel, I think the last figures for active travel were around €293 million a year. They're going to be about 360 million every year now out to the end of the decade, and then €10.1 billion in public transport. But as I say, people are beginning to point out the delays already to these projects.
Yes, and we have to talk, if we're talking about delays, we're going to have to talk about Metrolink, because Darragh O'Brien was asked at that press conference in relation to it. Of course, many people will know now there's a judicial review that has been lodged in relation to Metrolink by, I think, about 20 residents in Ranelagh. We know the impact that judicial reviews have had on other infrastructure projects, other big projects in the country, that it can delay them months, sometimes in other cases it's been years. So what Darragh O'Brien was saying today was like, look, it could be months, but in that plan, in that transport sectoral plan, it said that the beginning of construction would be 2027. And he was asked about that, and he said, well, I think with this judicial review, 2027 could be a stretch. So disappointing. Again, something else.
Yeah, I do wonder about that though, because I'd have to check this, but I'm pretty sure that they've said before that 2029 would actually be more realistic in construction, because you have to get to the pre-tender phase, you have to get to the, you have to get all the contracts in line, you have to get to the site works, all of that. But yeah, look, anyway, 2-year delay, if that's what it is, and that's what it's going to be to Metrolink. I mean, 20 years down the line, and here we go again.
Yeah. And we have all the other, warnings that we had, was it last week or the week before, that we'll need 8,000 workers to be able to work on this project. Do we need 8,000 workers at one go? I'm not sure. I don't know if we've got that clarification yet, but And then I think what the argument was made by the team in Metrolink that there isn't the contractors in Ireland
No.
to be able to, that have enough labour but also have the skills to be able to develop this. So that'll be a problem. You know, there was, I think somebody, a professor in Trinity, was making the argument that we should consider building an Olympic village type situation to be able to house these people. Brian Caulfield. That isn't, you know, we have had, I think it was 5,000 construction workers was needed for Dublin Port. So it's not like we've never seen projects of that scale to be done before. Now, this is the biggest one, I think, in the history of the state. So we really, this is another step up. But it's just like, well, where do those people, you know, live, for example? It's just, I don't know, one thing after another with Metrolink.
Yeah, and ostensibly it looks like things kind of move ahead, as in, you know, you would have seen recently they put out a tender for everyone to manage the contracts for about 550 million euro. We know that the 2 billion euros there is to get it to construction phase. The DAC, the DAC legislation will go forward to effectively have its own body to oversee the construction of Metrolink. So the government are determined to move on this. Sean Sweeney, the director of Metrolink, is going to be overseeing this. There is apparently, at least according to some government sources, a lot of interest from international firms on building this. But on the flip side of the judicial review thing, you know, the government is trying to bring forward plans to limit the number of people who can take judicial reviews, or rather limit people being able to, whether it's going to be introducing, as we reported in the Sunday Independent a couple of weeks ago, this scale of fees, whether that will act as enough of a deterrent. Do they need to go further? There's been talk of these emergency powers coming in. Is it too late, though, is the question? Can they...
For Metrolink.
For Metrolink, when a case has now already been taken?
Potentially.
Will it be fast-tracked by the High Court? I don't know. I think everybody... I just...
The one bit of hope that I did get from what Darragh O'Brien said, and it wasn't the first time we've heard this, I think Sean Sweeney had said it as well, is the potential for Metrolink to actually be opened in stages.
Yes.
So we won't have to wait for the entirety of the project to be finished. So, for example, you know, from Dublin Airport to Swords and Swords on, and we might see in stages Metrolink being opened so that people can use it, which I think would be great, so that we're seeing some people benefit part by part. I know I'm searching here, but like that's just, like,
I mean,
give us anything.
How many stops is it supposed to have? 20, 30? What if we end
over 19 kilometres?
What if we end up with 12 stops and it never goes any further? I mean, it's just this kind of thing is disheartening and frustrating. But to be honest with you, I mean, like, how much longer are we going to be talking about Metrolink? I mean, Darragh O'Brien, I put it to Darragh O'Brien recently to say, is this going to be your legacy? You know, he says, well, I'm determined to get it off the ground. His legacy may be getting it to the initial construction phase.
Which is what I think he said over and over again, was that it will be started, construction will have started in the term of this government.
And we've still no idea how much it's going to cost. Because we were told at the Transport Committee a few weeks ago that the current pricing, which... the cost range, which was around, I think, 9.7 billion, is 3 years old.
Yeah. And we know inflation, you know, anybody listening in or watching in today who's tried to get an extension on their home or any kind of building work done in their house, they'll know how much construction has gone up. And that doesn't impact just residential and people who want to stick 40 square metres on the back of their house. It impacts everything. So yeah, exactly. Metrolink will be impacted by that.
It'll be great when it's built. We'll be long gone.
Oh my God. Right. Okay. I'm going to leave it there because that's incredibly grim. Cónal, do you not? Hardly.
No.
Well, I think that's the point.
You never know.
Okay, well, just on that basis, because we can't prove you wrong this current moment.
Exactly.
Let's talk about IFAC. Bit of a headache for Simon Harris in his first week or so as finance minister. Tell us what he said, what IFAC said.
Usual IFAC commentary, and they are quite right.
The Irish Fiscal Advisory.
The Irish Fiscal Advisory. They've been, they have been repeatedly warning for a number of years now that government spending is off the charts. They're quite right. It has increased exponentially. And the planning ahead, the planning for that is very, very poor. And IFAC effectively said that you are not forecasting properly, you are not budgeting properly. And there was one line that Seamus Coffey, the chair of IFAC, said, it's as if 2027 doesn't exist.
Because they hadn't budgeted for it.
Exactly. And we don't. So the context to this is that we've had ballooning departmental budgets for years, overruns consistently, what are called supplementary estimates, effectively mini bailouts towards the end of the year, the fudging of budget figures, this sort of almost, I would say, there's a word, it's like sleight of hand economics or sleight of hand financing every year from the government under Pascal Donoghue, then under Michael McGrath, under Pascal Donoghue again, Jack Chambers, and now Simon Harris. Is it a headache for Simon Harris? Not particularly, as in the government and Jack Chambers and Simon Harris have both committed to getting spending under control, but, they haven't. And IFAC will continue to make these warnings. The difference, I suppose, now is that there is going to be what is called the EU, I suppose it's called the medium-term fiscal framework. About a year or two ago, the EU effectively said to all members that you need to send in a 5-year plan which sets out your spending ceilings for the next 4 or 5 years, right? The government actually were supposed to have done this some time ago. It was reported in September, October that it would be in the coming weeks. Simon Harris told us in the Sunday Independent that it's one of his first priorities as Minister for Finance to set out those spending ceilings so that everything can be budgeted for over the next 4 or 5 years, and that it gives clarity to government departments and ministers. This is how much you'll have. You can't go beyond it. We need to stick to it. We've sent it to the EU. The problem is that hasn't been submitted yet. So we don't know. And it's now looking like it's going to be late this year, early next year before that is sent in.
I wonder also the fact that it's coming again, that we know now that has to be done, and it's the beginning essentially. I know we're a year in now. It's a year since the general election. Will that be slightly different? That the political dynamic here is different now. That we don't need a giveaway budget, though. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil would deny that the last budget was a giveaway. Sorry, the budget before the general election was a giveaway budget. That we might actually see a tightening of the purse strings a little bit in the first few years of this government term.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's always an argument around those corporation tax receipts because things are really unclear where exactly that's going to go, because while it might be, 29 billion, I think, this year, they're forecasting maybe 34 billion next year. Beyond that, we just don't know because of the concentration risk in the profits of a few small multinationals. I don't think we're going to ever go back, at least not in the foreseeable future under this coalition's term, to those once-off giveaways. Yeah. The problem, by and large, is that
there would have to be an exceptional event that would happen to bring it back in.
Ukraine,
pandemic, Ukraine, etc. Sorry,
exactly. So I think at least ostensibly the plan is to return to kind of a much more normal, fiscal or budgetary framework. But as IFAC have pointed out, it's not being done properly, and we're still seeing this massive spending every year, these overruns in departments. And while the government in the last 12 months under the previous government and now the current coalition have committed to reining that in, we still haven't really seen the evidence of that yet, despite what they may say.
Yeah, I think we'll leave it there for this week. My thanks to everybody for tuning in. You can find us next week as usual on the Irish Independent's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts.